I'm honored to be speaking to this audience. Given the very little bit I know about your work and also your aspirations, your plans for the future for education in South Africa, I'm honored to be able to offer some thoughts on that topic, and it's a privilege to have you willing to sit and listen to me for 40 minutes or so, and then we can have a discussion later. Let me give a couple of comments about my qualifications to address the topic of the liberal arts. As Alvain said, I am a graduate of Hillsdale College. I will have some things to say about Hillsdale College toward the end of my discussion today. So that's the idea, is to keep you alert. So if you're interested in Hillsdale, then you'll get it at the end, but you have to listen to the rest of it first. I studied English literature and history at Hillsdale, so I had a liberal arts education there. I'm trained as a theologian. I write as a theologian, even when I'm writing on topics other than strictly theology. We are addressing theology tonight. You asked me to talk, it's going to be theology. I did teach for 15 years at a small liberal arts college in the state of Idaho called New St. Andrews College. It's a fairly new college, founded in 1994. I came just after the first graduating class in 1998, and I was there for 15 years. And when I arrived, we had about 6 faculty members. I was the first full-time faculty member, and we had approximately 12 students. So given the makeup of the faculty, we were all forced to teach things that we had no business teaching at a college level. So for several years, I taught a Western literature survey that started with Homer and the ancient Greek epics and ended sometimes with Dostoevsky. Sometimes we went in a little further, and I would assign a book by C.S. Lewis or some other 20th century writer. So I took it and I did a study of English literature as an undergraduate. All of my graduate work has been in theology, but I didn't have the opportunity to teach in that course for several years when I first got to New St. Andrews. And the vision of New St. Andrews throughout is to have a Christian liberal arts college. So even when I narrowed down my teaching mainly to theology after the first few years, we were able to hire someone who was actually qualified to teach literature. I narrowed most of my teaching down to theology. Even at that point, we were all conscious of trying to teach an integrated program where even when I'm teaching Bible and theology, I'm trying to teach it in a way that fits with what's being taught in the courses that touch on philosophy or literature, mathematics, whatever else might be taught. So I don't claim to have any particular expertise on this topic, on educational theory or on the liberal arts. What I bring to you is a kind of theological perspective on some of these things. And the lecture that I want to give, the talk I want to give, has 2 main sections to it, and each of those main sections is subdivided in 2, so it's fairly easy to follow. The first thing I want to do is consider the phrase liberal arts and raise some qualifications and questions about what that term means. The second thing I want to do is offer a couple of more positive perspectives on what a liberal arts education looks like. And I will, part of that, one of the subtopics under that will be that in order to have I think in order to have a coherent liberal arts curriculum, theology needs to be not just a subject that's taught, but a foundational subject, and I'll present some arguments in favor of that conclusion at the end. And then as promised, I'll have a few reflections on Hillsdale College as I knew it as a student, a little bit about Hillsdale College, the little bit I know about what's happening there now. I've been back recently, but I haven't spent much time on campus at Hillsdale since I graduated in 1981, quite a long time ago. But I will have some reflections on Hillsdale and how that fits into what I have to present. So what do we mean by liberal arts? I want to present 2 qualifications, one each qualification having to do with one of those two terms. What do we mean by arts in this context? How are the liberal arts arts? And we can work on a model that will distinguish between and even separate liberal arts as the arts that are pursued by free people from manual or slavish arts, manual labor that's pursued by slaves or lesser people. That can fit into a kind of dualistic metaphysics that treats the intellect, the mind, as the higher faculty of a human being. And so the liberal arts are the pursuit of the highest kind of knowledge and the highest kind of skill, and the manual arts are much lower on the scale of education and training. That, I think, has been a paradigm that's been used to discuss the liberal arts. I don't think that's a Christian paradigm. I think that owes itself, that's indebted to various kinds of dualistic philosophies that have sometimes interacted with Christianity, but I think fundamentally Christianity presents something different. The Bible never disparages, in any way disparages manual arts. In fact, I think the Bible affirms and honors manual arts in a variety of different ways. The first laborer in the Bible, before Adam tilled the soil, we read in Genesis 2 that God was digging in the soil and forming Adam from the dust of the ground. God is the first laborer in the Bible. God is the first maker, the first one who forms a being, something, makes something from the earth. And that the fact that God is a laborer sets a particular trajectory for the biblical understanding of labor and work and various kinds of arts. Not only is God the first laborer, but our labor as human beings has a kind of divine quality to it. And the particular thing I have in mind there, I think that's true in many ways, but the particular thing I have in mind there is the gratuity of human making, the gratuity of human art, the gratuity of human work. We do work to meet basic needs. But most of the work that I suspect that those of us in this room do isn't directly work that meets basic needs. I would be hopeless if I was forced to work to meet my basic needs. If I had to produce my own food and provide my own shelter, I would be going hungry and I would be very, very cold and wet most of the time. I don't have that capacity. What I do for a living is not something that is essential to survival. I think it is essential to the full expression of our humanity and the full expression of what it means to be the image of God. But it's not simply functional. Our work is not simply functional. Much of what we do is adornment and glorification of the world and not simply meeting basic human needs. Even when we meet basic human needs, we don't leave it at a merely functional level. We're going to go eat in 40 minutes or so, and you'll notice that everything has been beautifully prepared. You don't have raw carrots and raw meat. You have cooked meat, and you have cooked meat that's seasoned. Samuel Johnson said that every beast eats, no creature except man is a cook. That's gratuitous. We don't need that for our survival. It's an expression of our humanity, and that's part of the that's expressed in manual labor as well as in intellectual labor. There's no distinction in that regard between the two. Both of them are expressions of this kind of divine quality of gratuity, that we make things that we don't need, even as God makes a world that he doesn't need at all. Our work, even manual labor, shapes our not only our what we produce, but it shapes us as persons. It's part of our relationships with one another. We build bridges in order to connect people to one another. We invented computers and invented certain softwares on the computers in order to connect people with one another. Our work, which includes this manual labor, has this social dimension to it. A recent book by an American sociologist, Matthew Crawford, addresses this topic. Matthew Crawford was trained as a sociologist at the University of Virginia, which is has a leading department of sociology in the United States. He got his PhD and he was actually appointed to a position at the University of Virginia. He still teaches there and he does some research in sociology, but his main work is to work at a motorcycle shop that he owns. He repairs motorcycles all day. He still writes on various topics, but he wrote about his experience as a motorcycle repairman in a book called Shop Class as Soulcraft. And he argues that his work as a manual laborer fixing motorcycle engines is as intellectually challenging as anything he did in sociology. He finds that some of the same disciplines that he learned studying sociology, the same kind of diagnostic skills that he learned studying sociology, he has to apply every day to real life situations to help customers get back on their hogs and go speeding down the road. And this has led to a number of other books where he's talking about the value of manual labor, not just meeting basic necessities, but even as an intellectual pursuit, as an intellectual endeavor. That perspective, that what I'm describing as what I think is a biblical perspective on labor and art and making, did work its way into medieval Christian understandings of the arts and of education. Hugh of St. Victor wrote a leading curriculum book on the theory of education called the Didascalion, and he includes mechanical arts within his discussion of philosophy. It's not just the intellectual arts that are included in philosophy, but mechanical arts. Another medieval writer goes by the name Theophilus, the presbyter, talks about the role of the Holy Spirit. He points to Exodus 31, where the craftsmen who make the vessels for the tabernacle are given skill by the Spirit to make things, artistic craft skill that's given by the Spirit, who is the creator of the world, the organizer and glorifier of the world. So all that to say, to make a fairly simple point, but I think it's an important one. A liberal arts college may not be teaching how to repair motorcycles. It may not be teaching farming. But whatever you do in teaching the liberal arts, it should not be set up in a way that disparages the manual arts. It shouldn't be set up in this kind of dualism of intellect and body, this kind of dualism of free labor and manual labor. That freedom is the other thing I want to address, and I want to qualify in the phrase liberal arts. Liberal arts are the arts of the free person. Liberal arts are arts teaching that liberates the student. That's the aim. All kinds of education, every kind of education, I think, is a promise of freedom. It's a promise of liberation. It's a kind of exodus, at least an exodus out of a state of ignorance into a state of knowledge. But I think we need to be very careful when we're talking about the liberal arts to describe what kind of liberation we're talking about, what we want to be liberated from. And of course, I say this against the background of an Enlightenment and post-Enlightenment culture in which freedom is used in very expansive fashion and in ways that I think are basically incompatible with the Christian vision of humanity and the Christian vision of the world. Freedom is at the heart of the Enlightenment project. Dare to know, Kant says in his essay, What is Enlightenment? And daring to know means being liberated from the childishness of submission to authority, liberated from the childishness of simply receiving a tradition. We need to be liberated from that free education in a Kantian perspective. Free education would be an education that liberates us from our past traditions. And I think we can see that understanding of freedom in education works itself out in all kinds of ways, both in primary and secondary education, also in university education. We need to be liberated from childhood. For Kant, education and thought places primacy on criticism. Your first response to a tradition is not to receive it with gratitude. In fact, in some senses, I think you can talk about the Enlightenment as a kind of cultural movement of ingratitude. Instead of receiving a tradition, the first response to that gift of tradition is to criticize it and to test it, rather than to receive it gratefully, if ultimately not completely, even if we have to abandon some aspects of tradition. The first response of a more traditional education would be one of gratitude and reception. For Kant, it's criticism, the primacy of criticism. All tradition has to come under the scrutiny of reason. For thinkers in what Jonathan Israel has called the tradition of the radical enlightenment, this freedom ends up being a kind of absolute freedom, a kind of self-creation, a self-invention. But that kind of self-invention is actually self-contradictory and inverts on itself. It ultimately collapses. This is a point that Hegel makes in various places. The liberty that is promised by the radical enlightenment is liberty from all unchosen constraints on our desires, from all unchosen constraints on our projects, all unchosen constraints on our identity. We make ourselves by our own choices. We're free to do that. There's a famous passage in one of the abortion decisions of the U.S. Supreme Court where recently retired Justice Kennedy declares that at the heart of freedom is the freedom to make up your own vision of the world. And I'm not quoting it exactly, but it's mocked by conservative judges and legal scholars as this kind of woolly passage in the Supreme Court decision. At the heart of freedom is the freedom to self-create. But Hegel sees that kind of freedom from external constraints, from unchosen constraints, ends up being and inverting and dissolving the self. It doesn't actually free the self, it dissolves the self. Because we are in fact formed by, identified by, all kinds of unchosen constraints. We don't choose what family we're born into. We don't choose what language we learn. We don't choose the nation we're born in. For many Christians, they don't choose what faith to be brought up in. That comes to you. And for everyone, those unchosen constraints, that unchosen formation makes you who you are. And if you want to be liberated from all unchosen constraints, then you're liberating yourself from yourself. You're dissolving yourself. There's no there if you try to eliminate all the unchosen constraints. And of course, this takes a political form in various revolutionary movements that attempt to clear the ground and start over again. This is a passage from Terry Eagleton where he's describing an American literary critic, where he is describing Hegel's argument against absolute freedom. It says, since limits make us what we are, the idea of absolute freedom is bound to be terroristic. There's certainly the case for Hegel, who finds such absolute freedom epitomized in the French Revolution and names it the freedom of the void. Such freedom has a taste of death about it, but a death which is struck empty of meaning, the sheer terror of a negative that contains nothing positive, nothing that fills it with the content. That the last part is a quotation from Hegel. This purely negative brand of liberty, so he considers, is a fury of destruction, which can break with the ancien regime, but proves incapable of building another in its place. This is a logical incapacity, not an empirical one, since whatever such freedom might fashion will inevitably constitute a constraint on it. It can feel alive, Hegel observes, only in the act of destruction. Aspiration is thus strangely close to a kind of nihilism. You can come at this from a similar kind of angle, make the same point. Liberal education, free education, is to liberate us so that we can pursue whatever we desire. We can do whatever we want. But desires have a particular structure to them. Our desires are desires for particular ends. If we're hungry, have a desire for food. If you're hungry and you're given a hammer and some nails, that doesn't meet the desire. The desire has a particular goal or end in mind. But a desire that has no end, that is not directed to any particular goal, is, I intend the pun, it's a desire that is endless. It does not have any end or goal, but it's also a desire that's endless, that's tossed here and there, that doesn't have any direction or focus to it. It's just desire for the sake of desire. So again, absolute freedom ends up collapsing in on itself. I think positively we can say that true liberal education, true education for freedom, has to involve inculcating and cultivating desires for things that are truly desirable, love for things that are truly lovable. There has to be a normative element. There has to be a claim about what is good. If liberal education is truly to free the person to desire things that are properly desirable, it has to have this normative element. It's desire for the good, or in theological terms, liberal education has to be cultivating and inculcating a desire for God. We can also say that liberal education, it's education in freedom for freedom, is not education to liberate us from a tradition, but it's the inculcation of a tradition as a path of freedom. This is the point that many recent moral philosophers have made. We're always working within a particular tradition, and that tradition is not a constraint on our freedom, but that actually provides us a path for freedom. Not all traditions are equal. Some traditions are better than others. Some traditions direct us to things that are genuinely lovable, desirable, and good, and some traditions don't. Again, that normative element has to enter into it. So those are my two qualifications or cautions about the idea of a liberal arts education. Any Christian liberal arts education has to reckon with the fact that that the Bible doesn't disparage manual labor or manual arts, and it also has to wrestle with the question of what kind of freedom we're aiming for. A liberal arts education, I think, in a Christian viewpoint, would be an education that sees its goal and its aim as passing on a tradition not slavishly or completely uncritically, but passing on a tradition that is to be received gratefully, cultivating the desires and the loves of the students so that they truly love what is lovable. They love the good, the true, and the beautiful. By learning about the good and true and the beautiful, the human arts that involve language, history, the visual arts, music, and so on. A liberal arts education in a Christian perspective would at least have those features. I want to fill out the more positive aspect of my view of liberal education by talking in a couple other directions. Two perspectives on that provide a more positive framework for thinking about liberal education. Yesterday, at the end of the day, I spent a little bit of time talking about one of my favorite authors and thinkers, a German-American writer named Eugen Rosenstock-Huessy. Eugen is Eugene, E-U-G-E-N, Eugene without the E, Eugen Rosenstock-Huessy. He was born in Germany, moved to the United States immediately after Hitler was elected, and spent the rest of his life teaching at Dartmouth. I forgot yesterday, I was reminded. First of all at Harvard and then at Dartmouth for many years, and he taught a variety of different subjects. One of his main interests and passions was to understand what's going on in education. He wanted to understand the dynamics and the importance of teaching as a human vocation. And he talks about the classroom as a space and a time, and particularly the university classroom, as a space and a time where time and space are reconciled. Now, to unpack that, I have to give you a little bit of what Rosenstock-Huessy's main framework is. He uses what he calls the cross of reality. You can think of a vertical axis and a horizontal axis. I could just do it in the air. The horizontal axis is a timeline. The vertical axis is an axis of space. The timeline is between a past and a future. The spatial vertical line is between inside and outside. And he says human life is lived out in these coordinates. We all have a past, a thick past made up of a personal history, a family history, a church history perhaps, a national history, an ethnic heritage. We have a heritage that we have received that we are responsible for, that we cannot abandon, and yet at the same time, we have a call to a future that may involve taking us away from this past. Abraham is called from Ur of the Chaldees, from his father's house, in order to inherit the land that the Lord has given him. He has to leave that behind. If you're in the middle of that, which is where Rosa Pusey says human life is lived, then you're stretched between and torn between the past and the future. You're torn between the legitimate demands and the legitimate obligations that you have toward your heritage and the legitimate demands and obligations of a call to the future. The spatial axis he thinks of in terms of a kind of sociological space. You have in-groups of various sorts of which you're a part. You're part of a family, that's one kind of in-group. You're part of a nation, you're part of a church. You're part of maybe a widespread ethnic group that might be spread throughout the world, but still sees itself as an in-group. You have an inside, and you're obligated to you take responsibility for that in-group. You can't abandon it and just move into a new world. But you also have to engage with the world outside. You have to engage with other cultures and other churches, for example, and other ethnicities and so on. Now, how do you reconcile that? Rosa Pusey says that human life is lived out near the center of the cross, which means human life is a life constantly of tearing and anguish, caught between these different demands, all of which have legitimacy. And maturity comes not by abandoning the cross, not by climbing down from the cross, but by living within that tension and living with the tensions between past and future, between inside and out. But Rosenstock Pusey also says that the classroom is one of the main places, he thinks, where that reconciles the temporal poles of the cross of reality and the spatial poles of the cross of reality. He describes the teacher and the student in a classroom as distemporaries, not contemporaries, but distemporaries. They represent different times. The teacher represents a past. He bears the burden of a tradition. The teacher is usually older than the students, but even if the teacher is younger than some of his students, he still has, he's older and more experienced with the material that he's going to teach. And he has a burden to pass on this heritage of the past. What he aims for is to affect a world that will exist after he's gone. The teacher comes into a classroom representing the past and reaching out to the future, so that what he has to share, what his life is about, lives on in his students after he's gone. The teacher is a representative of the past, that pole of the cross of reality, reaching out to the future. The student bears the burden of the future call. The student is often, normally, younger than the teacher. The student is going to outlive the teacher, normally. The student bears a burden for that vocation to go into perhaps new directions that the teacher would never have imagined. And yet, in order for that student to engage the future well, that student has to reach past and find roots in the past and anchorage in the past. They're distemporaries. And the classroom is a place where the teacher, representing the past and the tradition, puts his mark on the future. And it's where the students anchor themselves in the past. It reconciles those two poles of the cross of reality and creates, in the time of the classroom, that creates a reconciliation of these times. The tradition is delivered to the future. The tradition that I talked about as at the center of a liberal arts education, you have a tradition that you're trying to pass on. Rosa Pusey describes how that happens in a classroom in the interaction between the distemporaries of the student and the teacher. He also thinks that the classroom is a space where inside and out are reconciled. The university, he points out, the original schools and universities were outposts of a universal culture, a universal scope of learning within a particular place. You have a school within Athens. Athens has a particular way of life, a particular political structure, but the school in Athens is interested in all kinds of things outside of Athens. You have universities in the Middle Ages that are set within Christian towns and principalities and so on. The University of Paris, for example, set within Paris, and it is set within a Christian civilization. And yet the scholastic theologians of the University of Paris are interested in the inheritance of another world, an outside world that existed before Christianity. And so you have Thomas Aquinas at the University of Paris working within his in-group, as it were, of Christianity and the church, but also bringing in Aristotle and ancient learning and trying to work out how those two things function together. A university always represents the kind of universality within a particular place, okay? And therefore helps to reconcile the tensions between the in-group and the out-group. So for example, you all, as I understand it, are aiming to have Afrikaans language teaching in your colleges. But you're also, I presume, are going to be teaching other languages. You want to pass on the heritage and the tradition of your own people and your own nation. But you also want to do that in the light of the histories of other nations and the cultures of other nations, and to reconcile the in-group and the out-group so that your culture that you're trying to pass on, the tradition you're trying to pass on, is enriched by those things that are outside, they're cross-fertilized by things that come from the outside. I think Rosenstock-Huessy gives us a way of thinking about the value of liberal arts education. Gives it a kind of cosmic scope. The classroom in a liberal arts college is a place where past and future are being reconciled, where inside and out are being reconciled. It places the liberal arts college in an extremely important position, reconciling the particularity and the universality in a particular culture. The last point I want to make, and more positive point, is that I believe that a liberal arts education requires theology not just as a single discipline among others, but as something much more foundational than that. And you can make a case for this just on a purely historical basis. If you're a Western liberal arts college or university trying to teach the Western tradition, you can't teach any of that Western tradition without grappling with the Christian theology that's woven around everything. Try to teach Dante without thinking about Aquinas and all the other theologians that he finds up in the various spheres of Paradiso. Try to teach Milton without grappling with the Bible and how Milton read the Bible sometimes fairly eccentrically, and how he added to the Bible. You can't teach the Western tradition of literature without grappling with these theological issues. So even if you're purely trying to do a secular kind of curriculum, theology has to enter into it because it's fundamental to the Western vision and fundamental to Western culture and civilization. I would say more generally, I think that theology is essential to the formation of a liberal arts education, because theology, this is a historical point and a philosophical one, as it were. As a historical matter, theology, Christian theology, is what lent the university its universality. It was the Christian vision, the kind of Catholic vision of Christianity, that nothing is outside the scope of Christ's rule, nothing is outside the scope of the interest of Christians. That universal vision is what animated the kind of universal scope of the medieval universities that arose in the High Middle Ages. It was the place where, again, as I said, the outside world, the pre-Christian world, was harmonized and reconciled with the Christian perspective. Without theology, I have serious doubts about whether a purely secular university can actually retain that kind of universal vision. What's the basis for that universal vision? What you end up with is different departments having their own perspectives. Within different departments, you have different theoretical perspectives. Everyone is in his own little tribe. The literary scholar, he may have a particular literary approach. that differs from all the rest of his colleagues in a particular university. You don't have even within the English department, the literature department, you don't really have a unified perspective. And he finds he has his deepest connections with other literature scholars who are operating with the same kind of methods that he meets at professional conferences throughout the year. And that's when he really, that's the community he's really part of. That's a dispersal. That's not a university. That's not a universal perspective. It doesn't give you this kind of harmonization and a Catholic view of reality. I would say more particularly that without a Trinitarian vision, without a Trinitarian theology, that you can't really harmonize the universal with the particular that is the calling of a liberal arts college. Another way to make the case for saying that theology has to be at the center of and foundational to a liberal arts education is to think about the nature of the humanities, which are what mainly that's the realm of disciplines that's usually being taught and mostly being taught in liberal arts college. The humanities studies the expressions of the human spirit, artistic expressions of the human soul or the human spirit, the great achievements of the intellect in the history of philosophy, the great achievements in music or painting. These are all expressions of the human spirit, of the human soul. Well, what do you do when you have a foundational perspective in the university that denies the existence of the human soul? How do you defend the humanities as a proper object of study? Well, what can happen, as has happened in many departments, at least in the United States, I'm sure it's here as well, is that the humanities become really a political study. They're not really about the achievements of the human spirit. They're about power plays, and they're about how a particular literary or artistic product reflects the power dynamics of the culture in which the artist was living. That's one direction you can go if you deny the spirit, or you can just become a purely functional institution that's just teaching skills and preparing students to go into the work world. But without a theological defense and foundation for just the basic belief in the soul, in the dignity of human production, the dignity of human art as an expression of the spirit, as an expression of a person being made in the image of God. Without theology, I think the university will collapse into a kind of functionalism or go off into other directions. As promised, I do want to end with a couple of reflections on Hillsdale College. As I said, I graduated in 1981, and I want to reflect on Hillsdale College against the background of what I've just been talking about. I graduated from Hillsdale in 1981. I've had a few contacts with Hillsdale since then. I've lectured there several times. Just in the last year and a half, I was there once again lecturing during their 500th anniversary of the Reformation series of lectures. I would say that over the time that I graduated and the present configuration of Hillsdale College, there's been pretty dramatic changes. It was moving out of a party school reputation into a reputation for being an excellent academic institution and a conservative, politically and economically conservative institution, which is the reputation it's had since about the time we were there, about the mid-70s and on. That's the direction the school has gone. So that was already there. What was not there was a Christian emphasis that is present at Hillsdale College now. And the Christian emphasis comes out in student life. As a student at Hillsdale, I was a member of the InterVarsity chapter. My wife and I were two of the maybe 4 or 5 people who would regularly go to InterVarsity Bible studies. It was pretty pathetic. Today at Hillsdale, there are several hundred people that are involved in the InterVarsity ministry. And there are other sorts of student ministries that are on campus. So the student body is much more vibrantly Christian than it was at the time we were there. And I think the faculty at Hillsdale also is more overtly Christian than it was in the days that we were students. My most recent visit, it was about a year ago, because it was during the 2017 500th anniversary celebration. One of my one of the happy discoveries was to learn how vigorous the ecumenical discussions are at Hillsdale. This was during the Reformation celebration, and so differences between Protestants and Catholics were being discussed in public lectures throughout the year. But that had filtered down into the student newspaper, it had filtered down into the student discussions. Classrooms were talking about, and I've have some contact with some ecumenical kinds of seminaries, which are supposed to have theological discussion across Christian traditions going on, that don't have as much theological discussion as Hillsdale does. I hadn't seen that in my previous visits, and it was an exciting thing to see that how seriously these students, guided by their faculty, are taking those topics. If I could lodge a criticism of the Hillsdale model, it would be based on what I was saying at the end of my last point. Hillsdale was founded by Free Will Baptists in the 1830s or 40s, 1844. It was founded by Free Will Baptists. It has not, for a long time, it's not been a denominational school, and it's not billed itself until fairly recently. It's now billing itself as a Christian liberal arts institution, but that hasn't been its general history. That move, I think, is a good one. They are building a large chapel on campus. Those of you who have been there know that they've put the chapel right smack in the middle of campus. But my sense is, I can't speak with great authority, my sense is, certainly when I was there, theology was not at all woven into the curriculum, much less foundational to the curriculum. You could go through Hillsdale, be a biology major, and never have to encounter any kind of theological discussion. That may not be the case anymore. You may have some kind of requirements. But I would suggest, as you're examining the Hillsdale model, I think there are a lot of things you can benefit from and learn from that model, but I would encourage you to think seriously about how theology can become more foundational and how the Christian faith can be more intimately integrated into the whole liberal arts curriculum. Because for the reasons that I've just suggested, I think that's essential to maintaining a liberal arts education, a liberal arts curriculum, and having it truly effective in passing on the tradition that we want to pass on to the next generation. Thanks very much.